Welcome to Disciples of Christ History. My name is Steve Regas. I'm a member here at Liberty Christian Church in Liberty, Missouri. I am leading a 15-week series on the history of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. I've been asked to say a little bit how this series came about. A few of you may know that I'm currently working on a book called Seeking Christ. It's about the difference between liberal Christians and conservative Christians. In the end, it will suggest at least to find a way to bridge their differences. In working on that book, I recently completed a pretty long chapter on the history of Christianity. The second factor is that Dave Culver, the pastor of this congregation, asked me last summer to teach a series on the history of the disciples of Christ, as there were a fair number of members of this congregation who really weren't aware of that. The third factor came in, and this got the region involved. I'm currently mentoring a candidate for commissioning in the region. And as part of the process, he has to take a class in the history and polity of the disciples of Christ. Unfortunately, there's no really good local option for that. And in speaking with the region, they said if he watches this series, it would fulfill that criteria for him, but they would also like to put it on the regional website for anyone else who wanted to study the history and polity of the disciples of Christ. I am honored to have you as my guest for this, and thank you for being here. Welcome to week 13. Disciples of Christ, roughly from 1940 to 2015, and this is called The Best of Times, the Worst of Times, Part 2. And there's actually two developments I left out last week. I told you the story that during the very brief period of time that James Garfield was President of the United States, that the Disciples of Christ Church in Washington, D.C. was so little that his driver was embarrassed. So he would drop President Garfield off, then pull up to a nicer church because he didn't think the president should be in a church like that. And apparently other people didn't think the same thing, that, we needed a national church in Washington, D.C. So in 1926, the idea of the National City Christian Church, have any of you ever been there? It's about 6 blocks from the White House. I've been by it, I've never been in it. Beautiful building, and the National City Christian Church Corporation was formed. And of course, what does it take to build a fancy church in Washington? Money. And again, I've told you Missouri isn't flyover territory. Who financed our church in Washington? R.A. Long of Kansas City. And apparently he goes, I'll finance it, but we have to have a pledge drive. Well, the church opened in 1930. What happened to a lot of church pledges in the 1930s? Somehow it got paid off. So we have this beautiful national church. The other thing that happened in the 1930s is this. Now, I know I'm talking to a very generous group of people, because I'm guessing most of you, besides giving to the church, give to other charities. You know what the problem is if you give to a charity? You never hear the end of it. And, every day, if you give to one charity once, you're on their mailing list for eternity. And they, of course, I think they sell your names to other like charities. And every day we're shredding stuff. But then, of course, there is the direct appeals on TV. St. Jude, Shriners Hospital, and of course the animal ones. And it's funny, my dog can recognize dogs on TV. So when, they come on with all these pathetic animals, okay, don't look. But fundraisers know how to pull at the strings of your heart. And that's particularly true of church fundraisers. Now, how do we do our missionary funds now? Disciple Mission Finance. That used to be Basic Mission Finance, And what was it called originally? Unified Promotion. Now, you all have heard of the United Way. And, the whole purpose of the United Way is to prevent, 1,000 different appeals for charity. Back, by the time the disciples were 100 years old, in the early 20th century, there were homes for kids, there were homes for older people, there was ministerial relief, there was this, there was that. There were actually at one time more special offerings than there were Sundays in a year. And finally, enough is enough. And so they agreed to something called Unified Promotion in 1935. And it was basically, we're only going to go to the people so many times a year. So the way it works now is we have the 4 special offerings. And then we have, for disciple mission finance, and then we've got reconciliation and week of compassion. So we're actually only having 6 special offerings a year instead of 60. So that happened then. So then a war came. And so 1940, of course, the 10 years before that were bad. The 5 years during the war were a time of 16 million people under arms. All of the industrial production going to support the war effort. And finally, the United States and the Allies win the war. And what is America like after that? We've been through 11 years of depression, 5 years of war. It's time to get on with our lives. And what did Congress do to help with that? The GI Bill. It's interesting to read obits. And there's not that many obits of World War II vets left, because there's simply not that many. But they used to talk about the class of 46. A few gals, but mostly guys who came back, went to college on the GI Bill, and then how did they buy their first homes? GI loan. And in the 50s, what else did the government do? Interstate highways. And it was a time of growth in America. And people in the 50s, at least in mainline Protestant churches, were very fertile. And the 1950s were a time, that was, in a lot of mainline churches, you could almost hang a picture of Dwight Eisenhower next to that of Jesus, because that was the golden era of mainline Protestantism. If you look around the Northland or look around Johnson County, the suburbs that were new then, think of the churches in the Northland, Fairview, Hillside, Park Hill, that were built in those days. At Fairview at one time, they actually were stacking the kids' cradles 3 high in the nursery. There were so many kids. And what kind of building? They built little buildings to start with. But every church, what did they have? A building program. I think I told you all the story, part of the reason we became disciples of Christ. My parents went to a Methodist church before we moved to the suburbs. The closest United Methodist church to our house was about a mile away. And it was a matchbox. Tiny, tiny thing. And we didn't even visit because my dad goes, they'll have a building program. Of course, then we got invited to the Disciple Church, and what happened 4 years later? They had a building program. But, 1945, 1970, 1975, that was the heyday of mainline Protestant denominations in America. And so much, I gave you that talk a few weeks ago. We did it our way. The disciples of Christ went through all the things that every other mainline Protestant church went through. The good times, the bad times, and then the really bad times. But of course, we did things our way. We had the tremendous expansion, the positive times, the nurseries full of people, and certainly it was true in the suburbs, but in little towns. literally every Sunday at Hiawatha goes, boy, I wish it was like the old days. You know, when the nurseries were full, the Sunday school classes were full, and that went on. But we had our own developments. I told you last week about the first split was with the Church of Christ, the non-instrumental Church of Christ. And then roughly in 1920, there was the problem that our missionaries in China wanted to, God forbid, take unimmersed people into the membership of the church. And the conservatives here said, no, we're paying their salaries. By golly, they're going to run the churches the way we want them to run them. And the conservatives and the disciples of Christ, based on that, began to distrust the missionary agency. They didn't like the fact that the disciple schools were becoming liberal. And my gosh, they hated the fact that we were actually talking to other churches, or as they called them, the denominations. It's hard to believe people actually believe this. But you know, for a long, long time, the other churches were denominations. We were a brotherhood. We weren't a denomination. And if you associate with them, you're giving credence to the denominations, you know, being Christians. You know, some circle was, we're not the only Christian, you know, we're not the only Christian, but Christians only. In some conservative circles is, yeah, we're the only Christians. So those things started to divide the denomination. And in 1927, the North American Christian Convention was formed. It was basically conservative churches who got sick and tired of going to the disciple convention and being voted down. And it's kind of like, after a while, if you feel like you're in an organization that doesn't represent you, what do you do?
Change or leave.
Change, leave. But it was interesting. They began to walk away, but they didn't actually leave. And so starting in the 1920s, you began to have a right and a left. The disciples of, and they were all disciples of Christ. But it's funny, the names they began to use for each other. The progressives called themselves, it doesn't sound like a very progressive word now, the brotherhood. And the conservatives called themselves loyal. But they were all disciples of Christ. And even though mostly it was the brotherhood people that went to the convention, all 8,000 churches were still in the Disciples of Christ yearbook. All 8,000 churches called themselves that. But as time went on, as the 20s became the 30s, became the 40s, the wedge between these two became farther. And I told you about the two newspapers. This side had the Christian Standard. This side had the Christian Evangelist. And of course, the Christian Evangelist that became the Disciple was the in-house journal. And so certainly there was resentment that one side had the official publication and the other side had a private publication. Well, again, one of the problems was open membership. In the International Convention in 1944 did something that was radical. They elected a president who was in favor of open membership. Not that the president had that much control, but it was just a symbolic act. In the year before, the family that controlled the Christian Standard, the Arets, were people who actually tried to reconcile. One of the Aret family, they went on for about 3 generations. He died in 1943. And at that point, you went from being right to being far right. That this guy tried in some way to be representative of both sides. And at that point in 1943, the new editor said, we ain't have anything to do with these folks. So the gap begins to widen, but everybody's still so far under the same roof. Then in 1947, the Christian Standard says, you know, why don't we call these people out? So they started a campaign called, what was it? Stand Up and Be Counted. And it was basically churches that were members and ministers that would write into the Christian Standard and put their name there as, we are opposed to what these no good liberal disciples in their missionary society are doing. And so you could look in there and see the list. And there was a thing, byline, it's growing every day. And so the North American Christian Convention met sporadically until 1950. And then it's like, why don't we meet every year? And so this movement continues to grow. There continues to be everybody still under the same official heading. But one side is in control and one side is rapidly becoming more and more alienated. They're already alienated, more and more by the day. Finally, and let me stop here. This was about as clear as mud to most members of Disciples of Christ churches. In a lot of the churches, there were the brotherhood people and there were the loyal people. And that was maybe 10% on each side, and in the middle were 80% who didn't know what the heck was going on. They just wanted to go to church and hear a sermon, be in Sunday school, be with their friends, raise their kids in church. But the battle was going on. And again, you're talking to a Disciples of Christ minister. So I'm telling our side of the story. The church I served in Hiawatha, Kansas was typical of this. It was like many churches at the time. The minister up until the time of 1953 was a gentleman, and this is just like really old people's name. He was M. Lee Sorey and she was J. Blanche Sorey. And you know how you look at the people from a certain era and they look like they're all 100 years old? Reverend Sorey looked that way. He was so conservative that you couldn't say card table in his presence. It had to be a quartet table. This man was conservative, but he wasn't this. And you know, there's a certain etiquette among ministers, is that when you leave, you're not supposed to badmouth your successor. And all reverends, they hired a guy who they didn't know what was going on, but Mr. Sorey knew what was going on. All he would cryptically say is, he's not what you want. And they soon found out what that meant. That he wanted to take the church this way. And apparently one of the factors that led to his termination, involuntary termination 4 years later, was that he apparently told the church board he was going to the Disciple Convention and went to the North American Christian Conventions instead. But it was oftentimes very under the table how this was done. There was an old guy in my congregation in Hiawatha. God love him. Poor farmer who grew up in the Depression, fought in the South Pacific in Second World War. He was conservative both theologically, but more than that, he was incredibly conservative financially, as you would expect a farmer who grew up in Kansas in the Depression to be. We butted heads over money so many times. He was, again, very traditional, but he had seen this struggle in churches. And he made the comment to me once that I have never forgotten. He goes, I like what they believe better, but I don't like how they operate. Because it was under the table. The Christian church, am I still in the Christian church in the town next to Hiawatha, to the east, Highland, they had an interim pastor, an older guy. And I remember this guy, he would talk your arm off. but he was a good old-time disciple minister who had gone through this struggle most of his career. He was telling me a story one time. He was originally from Joplin, Missouri. You have to understand that among these people, the loyals that become the independents, they had, I don't know what's Ozark Bible College, whatever it's called there, where they train them. And he was new in his disciple church in a community, and there happened to be some other Christian church ministers there. He made the comment to us, I'm from Joplin. Well, yeah, he was born in Joplin. He didn't go to Ozark College. He went to Phillips Theological Seminary. But the other guy didn't know it. He thought he was independent, so he starts telling him, oh, good, you're there now. Here's how you work it. You start finding a few people who agree with you, you get them on the board, and then you move the church that direction. And this guy looks at him and goes, why are you telling me this? He goes, well, you're from Joplin. You went to Ozark, didn't you? He goes, no. I'm a Disciples of Christ minister. I went to Phillips. But so many churches, my favorite board chair in Hiawatha, great guy, had grown up in a little town of Kent, in a Christian church, and this had happened in his church, that somebody had come in and gradually alienated them against the denomination. They ended up there. So finally, again, but everybody's technically under the aegis of the Disciples of Christ. So it's like the church in Hiawatha. How do you know who's brotherhood and how do you know who's loyal? And finally, somebody took it on themselves in 1955 to publish a list of loyal ministers. And it's been said that he did it without ever checking the accuracy. But in 1955, they had the official list. So the two sides are growing more and more and more apart. So what was the final straw that broke the camel's back? And again, where did it happen? Any guesses? Missouri. Very good. So I think I made the comment last week about the disciples. We claim that we were not a denomination. Okay, by then we have an organization in every state that looks a lot like a diocese. We have a national organization. We have homes for orphans. We have homes for old people. We have a ministerial board of relief, became the pension fund. We have overseas ministries. We have home ministries. We have education. We have all these things that sure sound like a denomination, doesn't it? But we're not. But you know, if it walks like a duck, it quacks like a duck, it swims like a duck, it's a duck. And so around probably within a few years of 1960, the people on this side said, let's forget this silliness and call it what it is. So they did lots and lots and lots and lots of study. And they came up with the idea of restructure, that we would go from being this loose confederation of agencies to being a full-fledged denomination, albeit one that's still pretty loosely connected. And so it was going to happen in 1968 in the arena of the municipal auditorium. That's where the convention was. And they were going to vote on it. But you know, these people are suspicious of the organization. They don't like Indianapolis anyway. And so finally, we are going to acknowledge we are a denomination. I knew a man who actually walked out of a church one time when they called it a denomination. Anyway, so there's an effort to educate people. But there was an effort from this side. What's your biggest asset in life? Financial asset? Your house, absolutely. Does anyone not have insurance on their home? Of course not. You have to. Certainly, at least while you have a mortgage, you have to. But you'd be crazy not to. Nobody ever wants to lose their home. That's probably the greatest fear. As much as people are attached to their homes, church people are more attached to their buildings. Would anybody disagree with that statement? I mean, since in the 20 years since Sean and I have become members, I would say we come to one church, but I was pastor at Fairview for 17 months, so forget that part. We've been members of this church, but we've lived in 2 houses. And some of you here have lived in a lot more than 2 homes since you came here. But if suddenly we were to say, we're going to, this is an expensive building. Anybody who's been on the board knows that. Why don't we just sell this off and, we'll go build a church on the edge of town that'll look like every other new church on the edge of town? What would happen? It wouldn't be good. So the people on this side, as we got nearer restructure, they circulated the message that if you don't leave by then, Indianapolis will take your building. And that was not true. And we'll talk more about that next week. That was not true. But they're suspicious of Indianapolis anyway. They feel like Indianapolis is lying to them, that the Christian evangelist, probably the disciple by then, is full of, well, of course they're going to support it. They're owned by Indianapolis. So, whoops. I'll pick it up later. So as time gets nearer and nearer, the rumor spreads that if you don't leave, Indianapolis will take your property. And you'll be just like every other denomination. If you're Methodist and want to leave, who owns your property? The conference, district, whatever they're called. If you're Presbyterian and want to leave, who owns your building? The presbytery. Don't even think about it at a Catholic church. So, restructure passed in 1968. And the story is that down at Municipal Auditorium, when the vote came, they actually spontaneously sang the doxology. But not everybody was singing the doxology. Of course, the people who didn't like it weren't there. And so, in 1968, or roughly thereafter, 2,300 congregations in 1 year out of 8,000 left. And there were hundreds of more after that. So that's when the split actually became. We became a denomination, the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, and we call them, the derogatory term is the independent Christian churches. And you're in a little town, you know how you can tell the difference between the two? We're in a big town. We're the ones with the chalice. And that's not 100% true, because there are disciple churches that don't hang a chalice. But if you walk in and see a chalice, it's us. And the technical name they have for themselves is the CCCC. That's the politically correct name. Christian Churches and Churches of Christ. Could anything get more confusing? But we'll talk more about that next week. So in 1968, this official split occurs. Now, I do have to say one thing. But even after that, the fight was still going on. My church in Hiawatha, in 1971 had a split. There were people who, it's interesting that the pastor was a good, I think he went to Phillips, good Phillips disciple guy. And the board chair was just as strong as, I want to get out of this stinking denomination. And they had a problem, Roger, that you and I might like. Everybody came to board meeting. Everybody came to board meeting because if everybody wasn't there, they might vote the church out of the denomination at that meeting. So everybody came to board meeting. And finally, like a lot of things, the disciple side won and the independents left. But it was still an issue. In 1989, I had decided to go to medical school. And when I got my MCAT, medical college admission test back, they were good enough, I realized there was probably a pretty good chance I would be in med school the next year. And that meant there would be a new pastor. And so my board chair then, a wonderful, wonderful man, who was in the handful of people who understood the disciple, he and his wife and I got together on a December night, and I told him, well, this is probably what's going to happen. And we need to make sure that when I go, this stays a disciple church. And there were just enough people there who were strong disciples that you could, I said the other side's underhanded, but when they do it's underhanded, when we do it, it's strategic. So Jim and I agreed, we are nothing's going to happen unless we talk to each other. And so the letter came, I got in medical school, I gave my resignation 5 months in advance so they would have time to get everything. I'm proud to say, you know how long it was from when I quit being pastor to the time the interim came? I left at 6 o'clock on a Tuesday night. He was there at 8 o'clock on the next day. So anyway, Jim had just enough people that he could make sure that the pulpit committee was all disciple except one. Because I don't want to say you have to give a token representation, but he had to have a conservative there to sell it to the conservatives. And that's exactly how it worked. And we had just enough strong disciples that he could also appoint a nominating committee with one conservative to make sure that the new board chair for the new pastor was part of the fold. And that, even as late as 1989, that was something you still had to worry about. So anyway, that was a specifically disciple struggle. But then there was the struggle that every mainline Protestant church faced. It's been said after World War II that Catholics became more like Protestants and Protestants became more like Catholics. Catholics became more like Protestants because they actually started to have Bibles in their own home they could read. Protestants became more like Catholics because as more pastors went to seminary and studied liturgy, that they wanted to have what you would call a more formal church service, more liturgical, high church. Now, there's some people who like formal worship. But, well, there's not that many people who are here who are a product of the 60s and 70s. I see a few of us. That it was my generation, the people who grew up in the heyday of the church, who also grew up in the heyday of people beginning not to trust institutions of authority. You think about Watergate and Vietnam. In 1975, did people believe their government as much as, say, in 1960? Heck no. And besides the government, what's one of the main institutions? The church. And people began to question the relevance. Do you remember that passage in the Bible? It's in Matthew, where Jesus is talking about the difference between him and John the Baptist. And he goes, John the Baptist lived this very strict life, and you criticized him for that. I have parties with tax collectors and sinners, and you criticize me for that. It didn't matter what you did, you were criticized. Through the 60s into the 70s, you began to have a civil rights movement. The United States government began the Great Society under President Johnson. Incidentally, what was President Johnson's denomination? Disciples of Christ. Disciples of Christ. And his state funeral was in the National City Christian Church. That when you inject politics and religion, right or left, there's people who get upset. The church is for religion, not for politics. Now, people in my generation, some began to say, I don't like this worship service anyway. I like Ted Nugent. I like Peter Frampton. Some said I like the Carpenters, but that was probably the minority. Why is it this church is so stiff? When I went to Bright Divinity School in the early 1980s, literally, they never said it in so many words, but literally the idea was if you didn't have a formal worship service, you weren't really disciple, or you weren't really Methodist, or you weren't really Presbyterian. Yeah, if you went guitars, you went all that, go see the Baptist, go see the Assembly of God. But it's like all we were taught was liturgical worship is the way to do it. Bright Divinity School Chapel was so formal that, you know how when we get up and leave and the organist plays the postlude? You're going to love this story. Carol's sitting up there. That we would sit down so we could enjoy the postlude. And nobody got up until the eminent Dr. Smith, who played the organ, was done. It was that formal. And that's how we were taught it was. There was a study done years ago that you asked people on the way out from church, did you have a good worship experience or not? And if they had a good one versus a bad one, a bigger factor was they liked the songs rather than they liked the sermon. And as a younger generation came up and churches became more formal, there were a lot of young people who said, I don't like this. I want an alternative. And there weren't 1980, there weren't a whole lot of alternatives in Disciples, Presbyterians, Methodists, certainly not Episcopalians, certainly not Lutherans. But there were alternatives. They just weren't in the mainline denominations. And so people began to walk away. Now let's go back to the politics. Some young people said, I don't see the church as being relevant. The church needs to get involved in great social issues. Well, the thing is, if a pastor comes out, say in 1968, on progressive social issues, is it the young 20-year-old, 25-year-old liberals who are paying, I'm not going to use an inclusive term because it was only he's then, paying his salary? No. Who was paying his salary? The older people who tended to have more conservative views. So again, it's like Jesus and John the Baptist. If you try to walk a middle path, the young whippersnappers are going to say, this church isn't relevant, you need to be more political. And the old people are saying, it's too political now. It's a lose-lose situation. And so more and more people began to be alienated. That's not just Disciple. So we have 1968, we have restructure, we have 2,300 leave right away, and more leave later. But you know what the interesting thing was? In a divorce, what do people fight over besides kids? Money, property. The Disciples of Christ, to use a marital term, had one heck of a divorce lawyer. Because when these 3,000 churches and their 750,000 members walked away, we kept all the institutions. Well, we didn't even lose that much money. These people were so estranged that 750,000 people walked away, and we only lost like $100,000 a year because they were giving so little. We didn't lose money. We lost the churches. We kept all the assets. Not a bad deal. Then something happened 10 years later. But we're getting into the 70s. The mainline churches are over the hump and starting to decline. Then something happened in 1978 that was only Disciples. Something bad. What was it? You ever heard the term drink the Kool-Aid? Where did that come from? Jim Jones. Anybody know what denomination Jim Jones was? Disciples of Christ. I see some heads shaking. Now here's how it happened. I forgot all the groups that Jim Jones had been in. And actually, in his defense, when Jim Jones first started out in Indianapolis in the 60s, he was great. I mean, he was the person who tried everything to get blacks and whites together. And what he did in Indianapolis was actually very admirable. But the reason he joined the Disciples was he always had some weird ideas. Do we have any creed? No. What a better church to join if you have some odd ideas than the Disciples of Christ, particularly if you just had 3,000 members, you're having all these people leave. Here's a church with thousands of members coming in. You know how much money Jim Jones and People's Temple gave to the Disciples of Christ over like 10 years? It was over $1 million. And, you know, he left Indianapolis, went to California, kept getting weirder and weirder and weirder, and finally moved to Guyana. And people, obviously, he was from Indianapolis. People knew what was going on. But at that point in time, there was no way you could kick a church out. There was no way you could kick a minister out. That it didn't matter how bad you were. By golly, if you signed up and said, I want to be a minister this next year and I'm serving a church, there was nothing that could be done. And unless the church chose to leave on its own, there was nothing that could be done. So we have this church that's becoming farther and farther and farther crazy, but still on our books. I mean, there's 1 year, the year they moved from Indianapolis to California and started a new church. If I remember the story right, if you look in the Disciples of Christ directory, you know, they used to list the 10 most growing churches. Well, number 1 was People's Temple. So this debacle happens. And suddenly we have to get serious about policing ourselves. That, you know, the days of just, hey, I want to preach. And, you know, churches could ordain their own ministers. They may still technically be able to. I actually went to a clandestine ordination one time. One of the couples in my church, a wonderful couple in my church, had a son who had gone to college and I think had a master's in theology from a conservative school, but he didn't have the magical Master of Divinity degree. And he was working with a disciple church, conservative disciple church, and he decided he wanted to be ordained. Well, the regent said, you don't have a Master's of Divinity degree, we ain't ordaining you. And the church said, fine, we'll ordain him. And you could do that in those days. I mean, this is late 1980s. They could still do their own ordinations. Now, the thing was that he was ordained for that church. He was not recognized, so he could not use the denominational machinery to get to another church. And I would not have gone to the clandestine ordination except he was the son of one of my elders. So I did go. Anyway, but we had to tighten up our criteria. And certainly I have worked with some people who are trying to get commissioned in the Disciples of Christ, who are trying to change their denominational standing. And I think about how little I had to go through in 1984, which is only 6 years after Jim Jones, and the kind of hoops that they have to jump through today. I mean, it's like, wow. We had to get our act together because of this. And then, you know, we lost this one church that basically by then had quit giving. But it was certainly a black eye to the Disciples of Christ. What's funny is, one of my elders at Hiawatha was named Jim Jones. And he wore tinted glasses. It's like, wow, we never let him make Kool-Aid for Sunday school. I can say that he's long since gone on to his reward. But all that's going on. I remember it was one General Assembly, about 87 each, and the general minister and president stood up and actually said this. Well, I think it's a positive sign. We've lost, this year's the first year in many that we've lost less than 10,000 members. But things are going downhill. And then all heck breaks loose. Does anybody know what the Stonewall riots were? It was 1969 in New York City. The New York police raided a gay bar. And rather than just breaking it up, the gay patrons fought back, and they fought back, and they fought back. And that was the beginning of the modern LGBT movement. Now, at first, most of the mainline Protestant churches were saying, no, this is, you know, the late 60s, early 70s, this, we may be liberal, but this isn't right. Of all the mainline denominations, what was the first one to be openly accepting of LGBT members and ministers? United Church of Christ. They ordained the first practicing known homosexual minister in 1972. And simply because of their background and their location, they tended to be a lot more liberal. So let's fast forward a few years. I mean, still, in our denomination, most denominations, this is not something we even want to touch. We've always been about unity, and yet we've never had a merger. You know, we talked to the American Baptists at one time, that didn't work. So in the 1880s, we start talking to the United Church of Christ. And they know there's too many issues, we're not going to have a merger, a structural merger. But we can have a mutual recognition of ministries. I mean, there are a fair number of disciple ministers who were serving UCC churches, and there are some UCC church ministers serving disciple churches. Fairview had a wonderful, wonderful UCC minister who was an interim, who they would have liked to have kept, but the rules of interims disallowed that. In 1989, there was an assembly, a motion made at our General Assembly I forget, it was in Indianapolis that year. I was there. Unfortunately, I was there. And the motion was simply that we go ahead and we recognize UCC ministers as being equal of ours. And that's all it was. Is that, you know, a UCC pastor can serve a disciple church, a disciple pastor can serve a UCC church. That's all it was. But remember this hideous thing the UCC's doing? They're ordaining gay and lesbian ministers. There were some remaining conservatives in the disciples who said, well, if you agree to let them serve in your pulpit, then you're agreeing with the whole LGBT agenda. And this is not what the resolution was about. But there was a very conservative faction that tried to make that about. That was actually the final straw why I went to medical school. I basically already made the decision, but I went to the assembly. I voted for the resolution. When I got back, there was this, if you can't think of something nice to say about a person, you don't say it. There was a conservative lady in my congregation who believed other church ministers more than she believed me, and she heard about this, and she calls me up and goes, Steve, I wish you'd been there so you could vote against it. And I go, I was there and voted for it. She hung up on the phone. And this is a couple who I had been very good to. When her husband came close to dying, you know, I was there in Topeka to see him. He pulled through. I had to go over to the house and literally scream to have her let me in and explain it. And that was about a month before I took the MCAT. If there was ever any question I would pursue medicine, that was it. But what was funny is that when I announced to the congregation 7 months later I was going to medical school, everybody except this lady was supportive. And she came up to me in this kind of squeaky fundamentalist voice and goes, I wish you'd come and prayed with us before you'd done this thing. It's like you're the last two people I would have prayed with before I'd done this thing. Anyway, but that's how the LGBT issue started to come into the disciples of Christ. Now, we don't have a pope, we have a general minister and president. Our current general minister and president is Terry Hord Owen. In 1991, John Humbert, who was our general minister and president, retired after 6 years, which is what the term is. And we had to elect a new one. Now, I know I've made fun of Southern Baptists, and I made fun of Missouri Synod Lutherans about manipulating elections. But unfortunately, we don't only learn good things from other denominations, we learn bad things. And you know, golly, if it worked for those Missouri Synod Lutherans, it worked for the Southern Baptists to manipulate an election, why can't we as disciples do it? I mean, hey, we're a denomination now. Now, unlike their elections that were actual elections, the denomination would put forth one name, and it was yea or nay on that one name. But it took a 2/3 vote. Well, I mean, you remember the days when Missouri you have 2/3 vote to pass tax and bond issues? Did they ever pass? Sometimes, often not. So anyway, at this assembly, I believe it was in Tulsa, 1991, Dr. Michael Kinnaman is put up to be the general minister and president. Dr. Kinnaman is not gay. He's married and has 2 children. But he's a seminary professor. He has a PhD. He's an ecumenist. But you know what the worst thing was? He was a member of GLAD, Gay, Lesbian, and Affirming Disciples. He was supportive of LGBT issues in the Disciples of Christ Church. And suddenly, in 1991, this was all that the election was about. It wasn't about anything else other than that Dr. Kinnaman was a member of GLAD. There was a man named Floyd Legler. Legler was a trucking executive. He got rich on his own firm. He was a layperson in the Disciples of Christ, and by golly, he was tired of how liberal his denomination had become. So he and some others took it upon themselves to print a letter against Dr. Kinnaman and send it to the elder board of every church in the Disciples of Christ. And I remember I was an elder at Countryside then. I was probably second year of med school. And we had this huge discussion about how terrible Kinnaman was, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, it takes 66%. And of course, the conservative side is marshaling these people to come to Tulsa and vote against this horrible liberal man. It takes 2/3 to elect a president. Dr. Kinnaman got 65%. So he failed. And so then if that fails, then you have a 2-year interim, who was a nice old guy who pastored churches, and he was there for 2 years. And then in 1993, and this seems like so antiquated now, a resolution was put forth at the General Assembly of the Christian Church in support of civil rights for homosexual people, like something would be very accepted today. Well, it wasn't very accepted in some quarters in 1993. By that point in time, I was chair of the board of elders at Countryside Christian Church. And we had a meeting one night to hash this out. That there's this awful resolution before the General Assembly that, my gosh, giving civil rights to LGBT issues? I mean, you can't do that. And so we had this elders meeting. There are 14 elders there, of which I'm the chair. And one of the conservative elders makes a point. We condemn homosexuality as sin, and we speak against this resolution, blah, blah, blah. So we debated for an hour or so, and finally the question's called, and I'm presiding over this vote. There are 14 elders there. Anyone know what the vote was? 7-7. So we debate a little more, and there was a wonderful guy. He's still alive, an architect, probably retired now. Anybody familiar with the term a Barnum statement? Came from P.T. Barnum. It's a statement that everybody agrees with, doesn't mean anything. This guy put forth as a compromise that Countryside Christian Church would forward this resolution to the General Assembly is not that we condemn homosexuality as sin, but we as a church condemn sin. Well, who's not going to vote for that? Well, there were at least 4 people who didn't, but that was enough to win the middle of the road people over. And so it passed. But there were four elders, 2 couples, the husband and wife were both elders. And they left Countryside Christian Church and probably the Disciples of Christ after that night. And this, like most mainline Protestant denominations in the 90s, in the 2000s, into the 2010s, LGBT issues became a huge, huge dividing factor. You know, there was one Episcopal diocese where more than half the churches left. The Presbyterian church that Sean and I got married in Overland Park, it split. I mean, they went to court over who could keep the building. You see, finally the Methodist Church is resolving that issue now. The Disciples of Christ and most of the other mainline Protestant denominations, about the time the Supreme Court ruled in, say the name right, Obergefell versus Hodges, in favor of gay marriage, other than the Methodists, most of the mainline Protestant denominations had come out in favor of that. But the damage had been done. I mean, we, other mainline denominations, probably more us than others, were in decline. And that certainly made things worse. But then we had one other black eye. This will only happen in Disciples of Christ Church. What does the initials NBA stand for? National Basketball Association? National Benevolent Association. Over the years, way over 100 years, the National Benevolent Association of the Disciples of Christ had built up this amazing organization of scores of homes for old people, orphans, people with special needs, and it was very successful, and it was very thriving. What do big organizations do with their endowment? Do they buy Krugerrands and put the gold in a safe somewhere? Do they bury it in the backyard? Do they put it in a CD at the local bank? That's not normally what institutions do. What do? Put it in the market. Do you remember the dot-com bubble? Well, apparently the NBA had some money in the dot-coms. So they lost money there. And then there was a Tuesday morning in September of 2011 where 4 planes were hijacked. Do you remember what happened to the market after that? So they'd already lost money in the dot-com bubble. Their portfolio tanked after 9/11. Supposedly, I read this somewhere, that the disciples of the NBA portfolio lost more money in the week after 9/11 than we had spent on benevolence the year before. By 2004, NBA was in bankruptcy. And they were able to, with their assets, pay off with interest all the creditors. But certainly it emerged from bankruptcy a much smaller, a much leaner, a much less robust institution. So we had our benevolence home go into bankruptcy. And then sometime around this period of time, the Christian evangelist became the Christian, then it became the disciple. But printing magazines is not cheap. And finally, we ran out of money. The Christian Board of Publications. You remember it used to be the disciple lying around or came to your house, the magazine? That magazine ceased to exist. So there are some people that said we can't get by without a magazine. So they started one called Disciple World. And if that lasted, that may not have even lasted 3 years. So for probably 10 years now, we have not had a magazine. So it's like, how do you convey ideas to the rank and file without an in-house journal? So it was the best of times, and then it was the worst of times. And some of this is uniquely disciple, but some of it happened to every other mainline denomination. So I wish I was ending on a happier note, but that's what happened. And any questions? Next week, the topic is alphabet soup. Because if you look at Disciples of Christ stuff, there's NBA, Division of Overseas Ministry, Division of Homeland Ministry, all these initials. We're going to talk about how this church, how the region, and how the Disciples of Christ actually works, and try to explain what all these agencies are and what they do. So if you have any questions, hopefully our board chair will be here next week to discuss how LCC works. And every disciple church works differently. And that's actually in some ways a bad point, but in some ways a very good point. And we'll get that to the last Sunday. Every disciple church functions differently, period. And if you've ever visited, every disciple church literally takes communion in a different way. And of course, you know what's unique probably about Liberty? I've been in a lot of disciple churches, but I've never heard one say, "Forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us." I was like, what? Why? Pam, have we always said it that way?
As far as I remember.
And it's like, This is the only disciple church I've ever heard of that says it. But that's okay, because we're disciples of Christ. And so, any questions, comments, funny stories, motions for the good of the order? I'll see you next week. Thank you.